For decades, Germany and Russia knew that a war was about to break out between them, and both parties had planned how to destroy each other. Germany wanted to organize a defensive with the 8th Army under Maximilian von Prittwitz, while the Russians an offensive to the Vistula with the 1st Army under Paul von Rennenkampf and the 2nd one under Alexander Samsonov. Rennenkampf would be the first to take action and would encounter the German army in a major battle at Gumbinnen, where he would either continue his advance or retreat. The German 8th Army was composed by the 1st Corps under Hermann von François, the 17th Corps under August von Mackensen, and the 1st Reserve Corps under Otto von Below was against the Russian 1st Army. While in the south, the 20th Corps under Friedrich von Schultz was facing the army of Samsonov. The 8th Army consisted a total of 100 battalions supported by reserve and Landwehr formations. German defences included fortifications along the Masurian Lakes, the Königsberg fortifications and the Torania fortress. The combined Russian forces consisted of 208 infantry battalions and over 9 cavalry divisions with 192 squadrons. The first attacked north of the Masurian Lakes, while the other army south. However, quite quickly, Russia was able to mobilize an invasion into East Prussia. Any invasion of Prussia was an important blow to German morale as well as her general strategic situation. The German deployment on the outbreak of the war left only the 10 divisions of the German 8th Army under General Maximilian von Prittwitz in East Prussia, whereas the Russians had been able to mobilize the 1st Army under General Paul von Rennenkampf and the 2nd Army under General Alexander Samsonov. They entered East Prussia on 7 August. Anticipating that the Russians would attack north of the Romanter Heath, then west along the Pregel Valley, Prittwitz ordered Hermann von François 1st Corps to take up positions along the Angerrap River. However, François advocated a forward defence and by 13 August had advanced his corps along a line from Goldap to Stallupönen, 32 kilometers east of his orders. On 15 August, Rennenkampf crossed the border with 6 infantry divisions, intending to follow the railway through Stallupönen and Gumbinnen. On 15 August, François men encountered 1st Army's reconnaissance units northeast of Stallupönen and captured Eiton that night, as the Russians withdrew. On 16 August, Prittwitz ordered François back to the Gumbinnen as he moved the 8th Army to the Angerrap after his Fliegerabteilung 16 reconnaissance flight spotted the 2nd Army concentrating. However, François kept his 1st Infantry Division at Stallupönen and his 2nd Infantry Division divided between Goldap and Tolminkamen. On 17 August, Rennenkampf advanced with all 3 of his infantry corps, but in an uncoordinated fashion. His cavalry was to the north, while the 20th Corps, with the 28th and 29th Infantry Divisions, north of the road, and the 3 Corps, with the 25th and 27th Infantry Divisions on the road and south of it. The 4th Corps, with the 40th and 30th Infantry Divisions, were advancing on the Romint Heath further south. François called up General Adalbert von Falk's 2nd Infantry Division in Tolminkamen and his howitzers in Gumbinnen to reinforce his position in Stallupönen as the battle intensified by midday. At 1 p.m, Prittwitz's envoy arrived and ordered François to retreat to Gumbinnen. François' reply was to tell General von Prittwitz that General von François will break off the engagement when the Russians are defeated. As Falk advanced, he was able to attack the flank of the Russian 27th Infantry Division near Gumbinnen, when a gap formed between the Russian 27th and 40th Infantry Divisions. A furious frontal attack broke the Russian division, which fled eastward, losing 3,000 casualties and 5,000 prisoners, including almost the entirety of the Russian 105th Regiment. Although the Russian 29th and 25th Divisions achieved some success to the north of Stallupönen and captured several captives and guns, they couldn't change the outcome of the battle. François decided not to pursue the Russians and instead ordered a withdrawal to Gumbinnen. As ordered, Prittwitz, capitalizing on François' success, moved his forces forward while François held Gumbinnen. According to Prittwitz, provided that the Russians did not concentrate all their forces against East Prussia and therefore sent substantial numbers of troops against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Eighth Army should be able to hold out without conceding too much ground until victory over France was assured. All that was required was for Prittwitz to avoid defeat and to hold his nerve. Originally, Prittwitz had intended to hold the line of the Angerrap and allow Rennenkampf to suffer heavy casualties while trying to force the position. German aerial reconnaissance by the Flieger Abteilung 16 indicated a gap had formed between the Russian 1st and 2nd armies, while radio intercepts indicated Rennenkampf had halted his army for a rest. On 20 August, François scouts, following his success at the Battle of Stallupönen, reported the northern flank of the Russian 1st Army was exposed and requested the 2nd Infantry Division for an attack, with support by the XVII Corps and 1st Reserve Corps. Reluctantly agreeing, Prittwitz commented, "First Corps had made a soup for us and we will now have to eat it up." With his initial success, François had persuaded Prittwitz to launch an offensive against the Russian 1st Army while the 2nd Army was still far to the south. François argued that his troops, many of whom were native East Prussians, would be demoralized by retreating and leaving their homeland to the Russians, and that the Russians were not as strong as they appeared to be. A radio message that did not use codes supported this assessment. On the morning of 20 August, after a night march, the German 2nd Infantry Division advanced through the Zulkana forest and outflanked the Russian 28th Infantry Division, having been left unprotected by Hughes and Khan-Nichivensky's cavalry. The German 1st Infantry Division engaged the Russian 29th Infantry Division at 3:30 am as the German 2nd Infantry Division inflicted 60% casualties on the Russian 28th Infantry Division, capturing Morwishkin in the process. To the south, Mackensen's 17th Corps and Below's 1st Reserve Corps were still moving up and were not ready for combat. Hearing of François's actions further north, Mackensen's 35th and 26th Infantry Divisions attacked Rennenkampf's 3rd Corps, consisting of the 25th and 27th Infantry Divisions, at 4:30 am. However, Below was not able to join in until noon. The Russians in this area were well aware of German intentions due to François's attack, and had spent the time preparing for the assault by moving up their heavy artillery. At first, the German advance went well, but it faltered once it came under Russian artillery fire, and the Russians were able to turn the German flanks and force the enemy to retreat in disorder to the Insterburg-Angerburg lines, leaving 6,000 prisoners in Russian hands. Meanwhile, Below's 1st Reserve Corps, instead of advancing on Goldap as ordered, turned north to help Mackensen. His flank was then attacked by the Russian 30th Infantry Division. The Germans were unable to advance and support Mackensen, while both sides suffered heavy casualties. The German 3rd Reserve Division, commanded by Kurt von Morgen, arrived too late on the scene to intervene. According to Buther, it had been a day of mixed fortunes. Despite suffering losses, François' 2 divisions had been largely successful. Mackensen's corps, by contrast, had been effectively knocked out of action. Its troops streamed back in disarray, with Mackensen and his staff swept along in the flood. 1st Reserve Corps to the south had acquitted itself well, but had ended just short of a decisive success. The German hopes of a swift victory, allowing them to turn triumphantly against Samsonov's 2nd Army in the south, looked increasingly forlorn. Only Friedrich von Scholz's 20th Corps opposed Samsonov's 2nd Army. Prittwitz suffered a lack of confidence, especially when he learned that reconnaissance showed the Russian 2nd Army consisted of 5 corps and a cavalry division, with 6 of those Russian divisions about to cross the border and move towards Mlawa. Telephoning Moltke, Prittwitz stated that he intended on retreating to the Vistula. Moltke responded with anger, since the German strategy of defending against one Russian army and then moving to confront the 2nd Army was now at risk. A retreat to the Vistula could allow both Russian armies to combine. Eventually, Prittwitz changed his mind and decided instead to attack the Russian 2nd Army. A change from facing an army to the east to an army in the south had been rehearsed by the Germans during war games. François's 1st Corps, joined by the 3rd Reserve Division, would move by train to the west of 20th Corps. The 1st Reserve Corps and 17th Corps would withdraw westwards. In the meantime, Samsonov was delayed in his advance because of the lack of good railways and roads, and Rennenkampf was slow to pursue the withdrawal because of his losses and limited supplies. As Mackensen commented, "I had the strong impression that my corps had not been outfought. nor had it suffered such heavy losses. In complete calm and good order, and without any interference by the enemy, it made its withdrawal. Prittwitz's panic affected Moltke, who feared that Berlin itself could now be threatened by the advancing Russians. On 21 August, Moltke decided to replace Prittwitz and his chief of staff, Georg von Waldesee. Paul von Hidenburg and Erich Ludendorff assumed their roles on 22 August. Prittwitz became the first army commander to be dismissed in World War I,